That morning, a light mist still clung to the surface of the creek, as the first rays of dawn filtered through the willow branches, scattering silver reflections across the rippling water. John Weller, a man who had given 30 years of his youth serving in the Navy, sat atop his old bulldozer, the diesel engine thrumming steadily like the quiet breath of the earth. He was there to protect his land, his creek bank, the place he once dreamed of turning into a small garden where he could grow vegetables, raise a few chickens, and finally live the peaceful days he had traded most of his life waiting for. But just as the morning sun began to dry the last droplets of dew, as John carefully nudged the blade to rebuild the rain-eroded edge of the bank, a white SUV crept slowly down the gravel path, rolling forward with the stealth of a predator circling worn-out prey. 3 men in black polo shirts with HOA compliance enforcement printed across their chests stepped out, their leather shoes crunching on the gravel with an irritating screech. They didn't knock. They didn't ask questions. They didn't offer a good morning. They simply stood there with clipboards, citations cameras, eyes sharp with judgment, and half smirks on their faces, as if they held the power of life and death over a piece of land that wasn't theirs. And then, a cold voice cut through the fragile morning calm, amplified by a megaphone. "Operator of the bulldozer, shut down the machine immediately. You are in violation of community regulations. If you do not stop now, you will be fined $1,000 per day." On $1,000 a day, on the land he had sweated and paid to own. On the creek he had spent countless sleepless nights studying, learning how to protect it from erosion, and the trash that washed in from houses across the bank. On the very ground he had dreamed of leaving behind, for his grandchildren someday. John lowered the blade. The engine rumbled once before falling silent, leaving a tension in the air, thin and tight like a drawn string, against the gentle background of the creek's flowing water. He stepped down, his mud-caked boots landing firmly on the gravel, and looked straight into the eyes of the 3 men standing there. There was no fear in his gaze, only a calm that felt almost out of place. The 3 men didn't know it then, but in that exact moment, they had chosen the wrong man to provoke. They didn't know that the person standing before them wasn't just an old man easily intimidated by threats, but a former Navy serviceman who had seen war, who had stood through negotiations where lives hung in the balance, who knew that true power didn't come from loud threats, but from quiet, thorough preparation. They didn't know that, on that morning, when they thought they could break him with fear, they had just ignited a battle they could never have anticipated. Over that land, over that creek John Weller had vowed to protect, no matter the cost. John Weller wasn't born here. He grew up in a small town in the Midwest, where rivers ran thick with red mud during the flood season, and men returned from war with quieter eyes than before. His father, a soft-spoken carpenter, once told him as they stood together beside an old wooden fence, "Land isn't something you own, son. It's something you take care of." That sentence stayed with John through 30 years of service in the Navy. Through countless deployments, through nights spent sleeping on steel decks with the sound of waves pounding against the hull, through rush calls home just to hear his daughter babble a few words on the line. He dreamed of the day he would step away from the constant travel, the emergency meetings, the thick reports stacked on his desk, just to find a small piece of land, beside a small creek, where he could grow vegetables, raise a few chickens, fix his father's old workbench, and breathe in the scent of wet grass every morning. And that day came. The first time John saw this piece of land by the creek, something inside him knew this was the place to stop wandering. An old trail ran along the creek bank, willows dipping their branches into clear water, the air carrying the scent of wind, fallen leaves, and life itself. He bought the land from Tom Mills, an old farmer worn down by a pointless war with the HOA. Tom sold the land at a fair price. No agents, no complicated paperwork, just a firm handshake, a nod, and a simple sentence. "I hope you know what you're doing." John smiled and replied, "I do." For the first 6 months, John lived exactly as he had once dreamed. Every morning, he brewed his coffee, walked along the creek, listened to the gentle trickle of water, to the birds greeting the new day. He cleared the weeds, planted a few flowers along the path, repaired the broken fence, and set up drainage pipes to protect the creek banks from erosion during heavy rains. To John, this wasn't just land. It was a legacy he hoped to leave behind, a final mark of a man who had weathered many storms and now only wished for peace. But that peace didn't last. Because the men in black polo shirts, with their smug smiles, clipboards, and fake badges, could never let anyone find peace if it was beyond their control. And John realized that his dream for a quiet retirement would never be safe unless he stood up to protect it. He knew that if he stayed silent, they would return, stronger, greedier, ready to turn his dream into a nightmare they could control with fines, threats, and rules they made up to suit themselves. John understood it was time to stop being just the man who planted vegetables, the man who sipped coffee by the creek, the man who fixed fences in silence. It was time to become himself again. The man who had learned to stay calm when everything else was falling apart, the man who knew the value of preparation and patience. The man ready to protect what was worth protecting, to protect this land, to protect his dream of peace in his later years. John Weller knew he was ready to fight, if that was what it would take. 3 days after that peaceful morning, John Weller stood on his porch, holding an old ceramic mug, sipping hot coffee as dew still clung to the blades of grass. The creek below the hill whispered its steady song, bringing the kind of calm he had always longed for. But from a distance, an unfamiliar engine noise cut through the morning air. The white SUV appeared once again, its tires crunching over the gravel with a nerve-grating hiss. John set his mug down on the step, his eyes never leaving the vehicle as it stopped in front of his wooden fence. This time, it wasn't just the 3 men in black polo shirts stepping out. Another man, older, with salt and pepper hair slicked back, a tucked-in dress shirt pulled tight by a leather belt, stood among them. On his chest, a star-shaped HOA badge caught the morning sunlight, glinting like a threat. They didn't knock. They didn't greet him. They didn't even pretend to show respect. They simply stood there, with thick clipboards, half-smirks, and sharp, watchful eyes, taking up the space in front of John's home as if it already belonged to them. The tall, lanky one with the megaphone shouted first, his voice cold, a messeter. "John Weller, we have ordered you to cease all grading and interference with the creek bank in this area. You have failed to comply with the Evergreen Bluffs HOA regulations." John stood silent, eyes fixed on the glint of that badge, a subtle contempt in his gaze he made no effort to hide. The salt and pepper-haired man raised the HOA badge, speaking each word with deliberate weight. Under Section 6B of the HOA, any interference, alteration of water flow, or disturbance of the creek bank within the Community Conservation Zone is prohibited unless authorized by an HOA permit. The word, permit, fell from his lips like a rope tightening around someone's neck, the kind of invisible power they were used to wielding to intimidate those who didn't know their rights. The man with the clipboard stepped forward, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're in violation. We will be issuing fines of $1,000 per day, and the HOA will proceed with enforcement action if you continue to resist." John's lips curled into a faint, cold smile. His eyes sharpened, not with amusement, but with a clear, unapologetic disdain. He looked them straight in the eye and spoke slowly. "And what legal authority does that badge give you here?" The group exchanged a brief, uneasy glance before the man with the badge replied quickly. "Authority granted by the HOA, representing the interests of the community." John scoffed, his voice low and steady. "I don't recall any state law that allows a private homeowners association to enforce fines or take property without explicit authorization from the city or county." The air thickened. The sound of the creek flowing over rocks became crystal clear. Birds chirped overhead, like a reminder of the freedom now being threatened by the men standing before him. The man with the clipboard lowered his voice. "You'll be receiving your citation soon. I suggest you comply if you don't want the HOA to take stronger legal measures." John didn't answer. He turned, picked up his coffee, and took a slow sip, his eyes never leaving them. In that exact moment, John understood with absolute clarity. They didn't care about the creek, the environment, or the community. They cared about power and control. And he knew that if he wanted to protect the peace of this creek, this land, he could no longer stand down. They didn't know that the man standing before them wasn't some old man easily bullied by threats. They didn't know he had once led emergency evacuations, had remained calm through the tensest nights, and had learned how to protect what mattered most through patience and quiet strategy. They didn't know that on that very morning, when they believed they held power, they had just ignited a battle they could never anticipate. John Weller, a man who had weathered storms and stood unshaken, was ready to protect what mattered most in his life: this land, this creek, and the peaceful dream he had spent a lifetime fighting to earn. That morning, John Weller woke earlier than usual. The dawn was still draped in mist, the creek below the hill flowing steadily, reflecting the faint light of morning. Standing on his porch, coffee steaming in an old mug, John watched dew cling to the blades of grass along the fence line. Breathing in the scent of damp earth and the crisp morning breeze, he tried to steady the quiet frustration still lingering in his chest after yesterday's confrontation with the OA. He knew, from the moment they showed up with clipboards, citations, and that fake metal badge, everything had changed. They hadn't come merely to intimidate, they had come to control, to expand their power, to turn the creek from his pride and legal property into community land, under the guise of conservation, making him the trespasser on his own soil. And John also knew that reacting now would serve no purpose except to fall into their trap, provoking him to lose his temper, to resist, so they could label him disruptive and interfering with HOA duties. He had seen this play out too many times in the military, only this time, the ones executing it wore black polos and cheap imitation badges. When the HOA returned that morning, John was ready. They stepped out of their SUV, faces set with false authority, raising citations and the crackle of a megaphone. "Mr. Weller, this is your final notice. If you do not cease all creek bank alterations and land grading, the HOA will enforce fines of $1,000 per day." John stood still, his hand resting lightly on the wooden railing, his gaze calm yet sharp, fixed on the man holding the megaphone. "I understand." That was all he said, voice even, calm. No argument, no sign of defiance. The HOA members looked at him with smug satisfaction, believing they had broken the old man living alone by the creek. But they didn't know that John had started observing them, watching every step, every word, every footprint they left on his land. The moment they left, John moved into action. He pulled out his old brown leather notebook, its corners worn, pages filled with neat handwriting, land markers, slope measurements, GPS coordinates of every point on the property, even the creek's depth at each bend. Taking out his electronic measuring tool, he rechecked the boundaries marked when he bought the land from Tom Mills, cross-referencing it with the county plat map. John walked along the creek, noting every small change, areas of erosion from last week's rain, patches of trampled grass where he suspected workers had snuck in to lay drainage pipes, and spots near the bank where water seeped with a strange discoloration, clear signs of potential wastewater leaks into the creek. Using his phone, he photographed each spot, documenting the date, time, GPS coordinates, and short notes. June 13, suspected leak from OA maintained lawn drainage. June 14, boundary marker intact, 63 from water edge, within legal limit. Each night, he transferred the images to his laptop, organizing them in folders by date, drawing small maps to indicate the locations precisely. He understood that evidence wasn't made of words alone, it was built from images, data, timestamps, everything meticulously aligned so no one could dispute it. But John didn't stop there. He pulled out his DJI Spark drone, once used for surveying in his logistics unit, inserted a fresh SD card, and charged the batteries. At dawn the next morning, as mist still hugged the creek, he launched the drone, flying it along the entire stretch of the creek from upstream to downstream, capturing high-resolution video of every bank, every sign of interference, and the hidden drainage pipes nestled in the thick reeds. On the footage, John could clearly see a gray PVC pipe, about 20 feet long, running from a lawn area maintained weekly by the HOA and ending at a small opening right at the water's edge, where cloudy water was leaking into the creek. Silently he landed the drone, saved the footage to a hard drive, labeling it, "Show a drainage pipe evidence, June 15 footage." Next, he set up a small infrared trail camera beneath a tree near the drainage pipe, recording at night. For 3 consecutive nights, he captured clear footage of HOA maintenance workers dumping bags of grass clippings near the creek, pushing handfuls of debris directly into the water, then stomping it down to let it drift away. He downloaded the footage, extracted clear stills of faces, HOA uniforms, and the act of dumping waste, tagging each with date and time, and saved it under the folder, HOA dumping evidence. During the day, John continued to play the role of the quiet old man. He still brewed his coffee, stood on the porch, nodded to neighbors, smiled as they passed by, appearing to fix the old fence or trim overgrown branches. Whenever the HOA patrol drove by, he simply watched, nodding calmly, never a word of complaint. They thought he had surrendered. But inside his home, John was building his case. File 1, land ownership records, certified deed transfer, county plat map, GPS coordinates, photos of physical boundary markers. File 2, water rights documentation, state laws, water management permits, drainage control rights. File 3, illegal HOA dumping evidence, drainage pipe photos, videos of OA workers dumping, water contamination images. File 4, OA encroachment plans, internal newsletter photos, diagrams of community expansion, pushing into his land. File 5, observation journal, detailed notes of OA visits, threats, exact dates and times. He purchased a laser printer and printed 5 copies of the files, binding them neatly labeled, and ready to send to the County Land Management Office, State Water Authority, a land rights attorney he had consulted when buying the property, a local reporter known for covering illegal dumping, and 1 copy for himself. That evening, when the HOA sent him a second violation notice via email, John quietly sat at his laptop, clicked download, printed it out, and filed it under File 5, observation journal. He let out a small, calm smile. There was no tension in his eyes anymore, only the quiet resolve of a man who knew this fight wouldn't be won by shouting but by paperwork, by facts, by patience. Before going to bed, John stood by the creek, watching the moonlight ripple across the water. He whispered to himself, "I've waited a lifetime to live here. I won't let anyone take it from me. Especially not some HOA bullies who think they can scare me." That night, John slept deeply, ready for the day of counterattack, with every piece of evidence in place, every weakness of the HOA exposed, and every one of their moves turned against them. The battle had begun, but this time, John Weller held the high ground. John Weller woke up early, the morning mist still casting a soft veil over the creek's surface. He slipped on his old flannel shirt, a steaming mug of coffee in hand, and stood on the porch, watching the first rays of sunlight filter through the willow branches. But today, the peace he usually felt was gone. Today John knew he was going to start fighting back. When the HOA sent their second violation notice email, John was ready. He printed it out, clipped it into a folder labeled HOA Journal, and sat at his wooden table with a red pen, underlining every vague phrase, every claim of authority they had no legal right to make. Every time he read the words, "under HOA regulations," he scribbled beside it, "no enforcement authority under state law." Pouring himself another coffee, John read all his property documents. The deed from Tom Mills, the certified water rights, the county plat map with its official seal, and a complete tax payment history. Everything was clear, precise, and airtight. John called Mark, an old friend at the county land management office, to confirm the specifics of his waterway ownership rights. Mark reaffirmed what John already knew: no HOA could enforce restrictions or impose fines on privately owned, deeded land unless backed by a court order or an official government mandate. John smiled as he hung up. He knew he was standing on solid ground. He also knew what they feared most wasn't a man shouting back at them, but a man who knew the law, held the evidence, and wasn't afraid to bring the truth into the light. That afternoon, John launched his DJI Spark drone again, flying it along the creek to capture high-definition footage of the HOA's hidden drainage pipe buried behind tall grass. He zoomed in on the murky water seeping into the clear creek, each frame sharp, GPS coordinates stamped in the corner. He landed the drone, pulled out the memory card and saved the file. HOA illegal discharge evidence SO 6017. John then set up an infrared trail camera at the base of a tree near the drainage site, recording at night. For several nights, the footage captured HOA maintenance workers, in uniform and caps, dragging bags of yard waste and dumping them directly at the creek's edge, using their boots to push the debris into the water. John zoomed in on the footage, capturing clear images of the HOA logos on their shirts. That evening he sat down, frame by frame, extracting clear shots of each worker's face, labeling them in a folder titled HOA Environmental Violations. He printed the images, annotating each one with the exact date, time, and GPS coordinates. John didn't stop there. He spent the rest of the evening reading state water laws, finding a clause confirming that unauthorized discharge into a natural waterway could result in fines between $5,000 and $25,000 per violation, along with potential civil suits for damages to private landowners. He made a note. Under this clause, I have grounds to sue the HOA for illegal discharge and contamination of my waterway. The following morning, John walked into the city office carrying a thick file. He met with Linda, an environmental protection officer he knew from previous water protection filings. Linda flipped through the documents, studying the photos, videos, and maps. She looked up, her expression serious. "You have enough evidence to request an immediate environmental inspection." John nodded, leaving a complete copy of his file, signing the formal request for an investigation into the HOA's illegal dumping into the creek. From there, John went straight to the law office of David, the attorney who had helped finalize his purchase of the property from Tom Mills. David flipped through the documents, then looked at John with respect. "John, you've done your homework. With this evidence, the HOA won't be able to deny a thing if this goes to court." John's voice remained calm. "I don't want to sue them. Unless they leave me no choice." David nodded. "And if it comes to that, I'll stand with you." That afternoon, John returned home, opened his laptop, and composed a detailed email to the HOA. In it he listed out his full, legal ownership of the property and creek, with certified documents. The HOA's lack of legal authority to impose fines or enforce restrictions on his land. The evidence of the HOA's illegal dumping, trespassing, and violations of state environmental laws. His formal complaint filed with the Environmental Protection Office. His willingness to negotiate in good faith, but his intent to pursue legal action for damages and legal fees if the HOA continued their threats or encroachment. At the end of the email, John attached photos of his boundary markers, drone footage of the drainage pipe, images of the HOA workers dumping waste, the property maps, and scanned water rights documents. Before pressing send, John closed his eyes and took a deep breath. There was no fear, no hesitation. only the quiet relief of a man lifting a burden he had carried alone for weeks. He pressed send. Outside, the evening breeze rustled the willow branches. The creek continued to flow softly, catching the last golden light of the day. The next morning, John received a reply from the HOA. The tone was entirely different. There were no threats of fines, no heavy-handed language. Only a notice that they would review their creek management procedures and arrange a meeting with Mr. Weller to discuss further. The John took a sip of coffee and smiled. He knew they were starting to back down. But John also knew this was only the beginning. He still needed a public confrontation, in front of the entire community, to end the HOA's misuse of power once and for all. He closed his laptop, stepped outside onto the porch, and looked at the creek flowing quietly under the evening light. The ripples under the small wooden bridge, once built illegally by the HOA, now served as a reminder of what he was protecting: his land, his freedom, and the peaceful dream he had spent his life building. Tomorrow, he would attend the HOA meeting. Tomorrow, John Weller would no longer stand quietly while they read him their notices. Tomorrow, he would flip the board. That morning, the Evergreen Bluffs neighborhood was quieter than usual. SUVs rolled slowly along the tidy streets, lawns were freshly trimmed, and tiny HOA flags fluttered on wooden stakes in front yards. But no one smiled, no one spoke loudly, and no one mentioned the HOA meeting scheduled for 6 p.m. at the community center. John Weller was up early, brewing a pot of strong coffee, sipping it slowly as he watched the creek below the hills shimmer under the morning sun. He still wore his old flannel shirt, faded jeans and worn leather boots, a brown leather notebook in hand, filled with notes and key points he needed for the meeting that evening. But today, alongside that notebook, John carried a thick, black binder, meticulously organized with metal clips. Inside he had prepared everything: county plat maps with official seals, proving his ownership of the land and waterway, the certified water rights and creek management documents, the drone photos showing the HOA's hidden drainage pipes leaking waste into the creek, the videos of HOA workers in uniform dumping trash and pushing it into the water, HOA newsletters outlining plans to expand community areas onto his land, the state laws regarding illegal dumping and property rights violations, the threatening emails from the HOA demanding fines with no legal basis. Each piece of evidence was numbered, indexed, labeled as Exhibit 1, Exhibit 2, so John could pull out any document within 5 seconds, without hesitation. John spent the morning walking along the creek, watching the sunlight reflect on the rippling water, reminding himself, tonight's meeting wasn't about arguments or pride. It was about reclaiming the peace he had spent a lifetime protecting, ending the fear imposed by a group hiding behind the HOA badge. That afternoon, John showered, shaved, and put on a light blue shirt, a gray canvas jacket, and polished leather shoes, clean but simple. Looking in the mirror, his eyes were calm, only determination remained. At exactly 4:05 p.m. John arrived at the community center. Outside, familiar SUVs lined up, residents trickled in, some nodding at John, others avoiding eye contact, and a few watching curiously, knowing there was conflict but not the details. Inside, folding chairs were lined up in rows, facing the long table where the HOA representatives sat in their black polo shirts, badges glinting under the lights, their usual air of authority unchanged. They whispered among themselves as John walked in with his black binder. One of them glanced at the binder, turned to his colleague, and whispered something, a flicker of worry in his eyes. John sat in the second row, back straight, binder resting on his lap, eyes fixed on them. The meeting began with routine announcements, patrol updates, lawn maintenance, end-of-month cleanups, but no one paid attention. The entire room waited for Item 40, review of violations and enforcement regarding activities at the creek area. An HOA representative stood, reading in a deliberate, firm voice, "We, the Evergreen Bluffs HOA, have documented unauthorized grading, waterway interference, and soil displacement near the creek by Mr. John Weller, in violation of Section 6B of the HOA Code, causing environmental impact to the community's shared water resources." Murmurs filled the room. Some residents turned to look at John, others looked down, a few shook their heads. The representative continued, "We have issued 2 violation notices demanding Mr. Weller cease his activities, which he has ignored. Therefore, we propose a fine of 100,000 per day starting tomorrow and demand that he restore the area to its prior condition." A heavy silence fell over the room. John stood up, his voice calm. "I'd like to speak." The HOA exchanged glances, then nodded. John stepped forward, placed the binder on the table and opened it, pulling out the county plat map with its official seal, holding it up for everyone to see. "This is the official county map, stamped and certified, confirming I am the legal owner of all the land along the creek, including water rights and creek management authority. This document confirms my right to protect the bank from erosion." He laid down drone photos, images of the drainage pipes, and pictures of HOA workers dumping trash, placing them in front of the table one by one, deliberately, without rush. These are images proving that the HOA installed illegal drainage pipes, discharging waste directly into the creek running through my land, causing pollution. Here are your workers, in uniform, dumping trash at the pipe's mouth. The room buzzed. The HOA representative's face paled, attempting to interrupt. But John raised his hand, his eyes steady. Please let me finish. He placed a copy of the state environmental law on the table, highlighting the section stating fines of $5,000 to $25,000 per violation for illegal dumping. According to state law, these actions are punishable by substantial fines per incident. I have submitted all of this evidence to the Environmental Protection Office, which has accepted the case for inspection. John paused, looking directly at the people in the room. And this, he said, pulling out the threatening email, is proof that the HOA attempted to levy illegal fines and overstep their authority. John closed the binder slowly, his voice clear and measured. I don't want to fight the community I live in. I don't want lawsuits, and I don't want to turn this creek into a legal battleground. I only want to protect my legal rights, and to protect this creek from abuse and pollution. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of neighbors he had seen while walking his dog, mowing his lawn, and sharing quiet greetings. But if forced, I will sue, and I will win. The room fell silent. The air conditioner hummed quietly, and the clock ticked on the wall, every eye focused on John. A resident near the aisle stood up, speaking clearly. I support Mr. Weller. I may not know the law, but I know a man who quietly picks up trash around the creek isn't destroying the environment. Another voice followed. We can't let the HOA get away with this. The murmurs grew into a ripple of agreement. At the HOA table, the usual confidence drained from their faces, replaced with confusion and fear. The representative gripped the microphone, his voice shaking. We will need time to review these allegations. This meeting is adjourned. John nodded, picked up his binder, and walked out of the meeting in silence. Outside, a cool breeze swept through the willows, the moonlight glinting off the creek as it rippled gently, a quiet song flowing through him. He knew the fight wasn't over, but at that moment, the tide had turned. The HOA had lost the false fear they once cast over the community. And John Weller, a man who had spent a lifetime learning how to protect what he loved, knew he had just won the first battle to defend his creek, his land, and his freedom. After the meeting, it was as if an invisible knot had loosened around Evergreen Bluffs. Conversations about the HOA were no longer whispered in fear, but became open discussions at the corner coffee shop, over fences while walking dogs, or in the small park near the community center. John Weller kept to his routine. Each morning, he brewed his coffee and stood on his porch, watching the mist slowly lift from the creek, listening to birdsong through the willow branches, breathing in the fresh scent of damp grass on the breeze. But within him, a quiet peace had returned. He knew the HOA now understood he was not someone they could intimidate, and they had tasted defeat when confronted in front of the community. A week after the meeting, John received a call from an HOA board member. The voice was softer, stripped of the usual tension. Mr. Weller, the board would like to discuss the creek, amicably. We acknowledge your ownership and want to find a way for the community to still enjoy it, with your agreement. John paused for a moment. He never sought victory just to prove he was right. He wanted peace. And he knew that if the community could enjoy the creek's beauty, with proper respect, that would be the greatest victory of all. We'll meet by the creek, not in the meeting room. John replied. Bring coffee. On the day they agreed, the HOA member and two others stepped out of their SUV, without clipboards, badges, or cameras, just carrying steaming paper cups. They walked along the creek, and John showed them where he had reinforced the banks with large stones to prevent erosion, where he had planted vetiver grass to stabilize the soil, and where he let wildflowers grow to bring back the bees and butterflies. He even pointed out the spot where the HOA had once discharged waste, now cleaner, though a stain still marked the grass. The HOA members stood silently, then turned to John. You've taken better care of this place than anyone ever has. John only smiled softly. Because it's mine. But I'm not selfish. I just won't be controlled by people who don't truly understand or care. They nodded and offered. If you agree, we can make this a community park under a private agreement. You keep ownership, but allow residents to walk, fish, and enjoy the creek during the day, as long as there's no trash, no construction, and no interference with the waterway. John looked at the water glinting under the sunlight, remembering what his father once said, land isn't something to own. It's something to care for. He agreed. But there will be clear rules. The HOA must commit to no illegal dumping, and no structures without my approval. They shook hands for the first time, no longer with suspicion, but with respect. Word spread quickly in the community. That weekend, John opened a small gate by his fence and set up a simple wooden sign, Weller Creek Commons, private conservation land. Open during the day for the community. Please, no littering, no loud noise. Respect the ecosystem. On the first day, a few families brought their children, shyly standing by the creek to skip stones. An elderly couple brought folding chairs to sit and watch the shimmering water. Young people came with cameras, capturing the wildflowers, sparrows, and butterflies dancing in the light. John walked along the creek, greeting everyone, showing the children the tiny fish hiding under the willows, teaching them to stand still so dragonflies would land on the water's surface. A week later, a group of young volunteers from the neighborhood started picking up litter and trimming grass along the small trail, careful not to disturb the wildflowers. They asked John if they could place a few wooden benches and recycling bins, and he agreed, as long as they did not harm the plants or block the pathways of the creatures living by the creek. Weller Creek Commons became a special place. There were no threatening signs of fines, no harsh regulations, only the laughter of children, the quiet reading of elders, and the steady footsteps of joggers. Everyone understood they were entering a place to respect, not a place to claim. At night, John would sit on his porch, listening to the crickets and the soft murmur of the creek at peace. There were no more fine notices, no hidden HOA cameras, no baseless threats. Instead, neighbors smiled and greeted him, and children waved and called out, "Mr. John," as they played near the water. The creek, once a target for the OA's control, had become a treasured community space, thanks to John's quiet determination. He had turned threats into a living legacy, proving that protecting what is yours isn't selfish. It is how you protect what truly matters for everyone. Autumn arrived quietly in evergreen bluffs. Leaves turned gold on the willows, drifting softly onto the shimmering creek under the afternoon sun. The breeze carried the scent of freshly cut earth and cool water, making each morning feel like a precious gift to those willing to pause, breathe deeply, and listen. Weller Creek Commons had become an inseparable part of the community. People no longer called it the Old Man John's land, but simply Orr Creek. Everyone knew it still legally belonged to John Weller, the man who had quietly protected it with unwavering resolve, wisdom, and love for nature. But the greatest change wasn't the new benches along the trail, the neatly placed recycling bins, or the small paths formed by neighbors walking by the creek. The real change was in how people began to see ownership and responsibility toward the land they lived on. People understood that protecting a place wasn't about keeping it to oneself, nor was it about using it to control others. It was about learning to love, care for, share and respect its true value. And John Weller, the man who once stood before the HOA with a thick binder of evidence, now sat quietly on a wooden bench by the creek, listening to the water's gentle flow, watching children laugh, and seeing elders stroll peacefully by. Because he knew, in the end, he had found the most precious thing in his life, a place to call home. And a community that had learned how to cherish it. And that was the story of how an ordinary man, wearing an old flannel shirt, carrying a notebook filled with scribbled notes, and holding a steadfast heart, quietly stood up to protect the land and creek he loved from unjust control. John Weller wasn't a hero from an action movie. He had no flashy catchphrases, no dramatic standoffs. He simply stood firm, patiently gathering evidence, reading every line of the law, and taking steady steps to preserve the peace of his land. He didn't just protect the creek. He protected kindness, fairness, and the spirit of responsibility that every community needs to grow sustainably. And through his quiet resolve, he turned a place once marred by conflict into a shared space, where children could laugh, elders could sit and read, and neighbors could greet each other with a smile each morning. As you listen to this story, maybe you'll find yourself asking, what truly matters to you? A busy job, a fast-paced life, or a quiet moment where you can hear the water flowing, the birds singing, and know that you are truly living, truly connected to the place you belong. If you have a place worth protecting, whether it's a small garden, a sunlit balcony, or simply a value you believe in, stand firm. Because it's that quiet determination that makes a difference, not just for you, but for everyone around you. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If it gave you a new perspective or a gentle inspiration, please hit like and subscribe so we can continue sharing more heartfelt, meaningful stories like this together. And if you have your own story to share or a perspective on life you'd like to express, leave a comment below. I read every single one, and I deeply appreciate each of your stories. Wishing you a peaceful evening, a calm tomorrow, and a fulfilling life, where you can always find quiet joy in the smallest moments.